This podcast is made possible in part by the generous contribution of our Smart Insiders Plus members. If you're not a member, join in now. Just go to smartrecovery.org/insiders.
Welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm Luke Frazier. Today on the program, we'll be having a conversation with Alex Collier, founder and president of the Albertus Project, a nonprofit organization that seeks to change the kinds of conversations we have about addiction through education and advocacy. Alex, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Really looking forward to being here.
So I was looking through your material, some of the website, and I was moved by a simple statement you had defining your vision, which was transforming the way the world views addiction from a mindset of blame and shame to compassion and support. Is that kind of where everything starts with Albertus Project?
Yeah, no, exactly. I honestly, a year and a half ago, knew absolutely nothing about addiction, held some pretty stigmatized views just by nature of, when you're a little kid, you're taught that, addiction is bad and people who do drugs are bad. So I held all these kind of preconception and these different notions. But my best friend was Reed McGregor, a person I love dearly, hardworking, ambitious, kind. And I knew at one point she was struggling with addiction. But for all intents and purposes, I was not super educated. She went to rehab and I'm like, oh, problem solved. We're all good here. And then unfortunately, she passed away early in January 2021. And I just realized the world around her, including myself, while not even purposely, doesn't show compassion and to support with people who have an addiction. And it really is a disease. And I learned so much about it thereafter, after she passed, and realized the way that we treat people with addiction is one of, hey, this is your problem, you need to fix it, versus something more of a physical ailment or even mental health. It's getting to the point where we're supporting these people and rallying around them. Like if someone has cancer, we're not like, oh, you're a cancer. Why is it someone who has a substance use disorder? Why do we say, oh, you're an addict? That is not who these people are.
Yeah.
So,
and that gets right into the issue of stigma and what we do about labels. And we'll be talking about that, I'm sure, a little bit further along in the conversation. But I'm so sorry to hear about your friend Reed. It's tragic. And there's been so many tragedies and so many overdose deaths that are just, and there's no other word for it. It's just it's a tragic circumstance. And, what you did, though, you took that tragedy and tried to turn it into something. And that's where you came up with the idea for, how did the idea for Albertus Project come up after your situation?
Yeah, so after my friend passed, I realized just how little I knew. I knew that my friend Reed was like fearless, and that if something can quote unquote beat her, I really needed to sink my teeth into it and try to figure it out. When I went online, I found it very difficult just to get the basic answers to the questions that I had. Like, is this genetic? What could I have done? I felt a lot of guilt. And everything that I saw online was either sort of spiritual based or, while it's great, there was a lot of medical journals, and I'm not inclined necessarily to read 60 pages just to get to the bottom of the answer.
And they're fine print and small print, I'm sure.
Exactly. It's like I literally could have spent all day reading it, and frankly, I did. But I realized for people who don't have a passion about doing something like I do, that they're not going to spend the time to do it. So I knew I wanted to do something. And while Reed was suffering with her addiction, she was helping so many others. And I didn't know that till after she passed. So I knew the one thing that I wanted to do was figure out how I could honor her and make sure that no best friend sort of had to go through what I did. It was a really trying process. So what I decided to do was found the Albertus Project, which is named after the street where she grew up, and we shared a lot of fond memories and got to hang out in Toronto on Albertus Avenue. And I realized there was a couple of things. The first thing is that we have to figure out how to redefine the way that we look at addiction. Just like basically we were talking about, we held, people hold a lot of misconceptions. There's a tons of myth. The second thing is to empower people who are suffering. These people feel isolated and alone. That's what addiction is, and we need to rally around them to support. The next, which arguably to me was where it all started, was the education, and the last one is destigma and destigmatization, but without being able to just sort of quickly show people like, hey, this is what it is, and this is what you might think, but this is the truth. People aren't going to take the time to sift through medical journals. So what the Albertus Project does a lot is, I'm young, I love using social media, and we have a bunch of different resources on our website where even if you spend 2 to 3 minutes, you'll be able to sort of get all the information you need. It's bite-sized information.
Sure. So that's the channels that make sense to address these things in a quick and an effective way. And there's always more information that people can seek and more study and other kinds of ways they can get information. But you mentioned that Reed often helped other people. And what kinds of ways are you referring to kind of her life and what she was all about?
Yeah. So, I mean, Reed just really was the kindest person. And her funeral obviously was so sad, and I couldn't be back home in Toronto. And it was at the height of the pandemic, so it was online on Zoom. But by nature of that, you had people from all over the world, which I didn't realize Reed, had connections all over the world. But I remember at the end, we ended up having breakout rooms where we had like a elementary school, so people who knew from elementary school would join that, and we had a friends and a family, and then we had a recovery group. And I was sort of scared because I didn't know at the time, like, what does recovery really mean? And I remember I went into that breakout room just to sort of say hi. And there was like 15, 20 people in there. And they were all sharing stories, how they are sober or in a much better place, or when they were down, Reed was helping them. And I knew how special my friend was. But to just know that she was suffering, she didn't tell anyone, but she had the power and the influence people get through a tough time. That to me is exactly who the person that she was. And that was sort of the time where I realized, like, I got to keep on doing the work that she is. Just because she's no longer here, she inspired me to start something to help others.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. There you were, and you didn't necessarily think you were going to run into that group of people who were talking about Reed in a certain way. But that strikes me, for better or worse, it's a Zoom world. And in some ways, I mean, I talk on this program about being in recovery myself and going to Zoom meetings since the pandemic for, the support groups that I go to.
Yeah.
But it's such a blessing in disguise, in a sense that, these new environments can be created. These new ways of interacting can be created. And Reed's funeral was a perfect example of that.
Exactly. It was a nice little community, and I think people felt a little bit more comfortable. I don't know, in person, there wouldn't have been a recovery group. We would have felt like those people were ostracized. So it was nice just to feel like there was a community via online. And people who were, like, for example, in the UK, I don't know if they would have been able to fly over. So it was just nice that I got to meet them that way and be able to, remember a friend.
Yeah. Now, the energy then you took from this awful circumstance, and you said you wanted to found something called the Albertus Project, based on the street where you guys had some great times. I mean, what did it take first to do that? I mean, how did you really just get started doing this organizational thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Honestly, everyone kept on saying, Alex, are you sure you want to start something? It's going to be a lot of work. And I said, of course, like I'm just that type of person. I'm determined. But I was trying to see, okay, maybe I don't start something, but I really volunteer and sink my time into other organizations. And there are so many amazing organizations out there, and I've had the opportunity to network and help and support and vice versa. But what I really felt like there was just a gap in someone running a nonprofit cater to people who don't get it. Because frankly, all the people who are running amazing nonprofits, like awesome, and they're doing such good work, it is really catered towards people who already get it. So I don't want to say it's like an echo chamber, but it's sort of an echo chamber. I never have been supportive of legalizing drugs. I didn't care about really the addiction scene. I thought that it was their fault. I didn't think it was a disease. I come in with this. So I was like, if I thought that, I can only imagine what other people think. And maybe I can use that to my advantage to start slowly messaging the way that I think these people will get it. So that is why I was like, you know what? I think there's a really unique value add here. So while half of what we do is really support the addiction community, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, the other half is simply outreach to, like, for example, my friends who probably held the same beliefs that I did that no longer do because I've educated them, they've taken the time. But it was a difficult process trying to figure out, like, what the heck am I going to do with this? Because I know this is such a complex issue, but where am I going to put my time? And that's where the first thing that I knew that I wanted to do was that education piece, where a lot of people were asking me, like, hey, what meeting should I be attending? Or if I'm a family member of someone suffering, what could I do? And you can't just Google that stuff. It's not a simple answer because I tried and I failed. I couldn't find anything. So what I started to do was I wrote all the questions that I had down that I wish I would have known before Reed had passed. And now I want to know. And then I started doing the research. I started compiling the information and putting it in, like, bite-sized graphic alluring stuff that I could throw online. And it really caught wind for a lot of people who, I would say a lot of the people who follow us are also, like me, very new to understanding this space. And they don't feel judged that they don't know the answer, right? Or they have myths in their head that they're believing are to be true. I think it's important that we create an environment where even if you're wrong, that's totally okay. It's just about you trying to learn.
Yeah, that's Alex Collier. She's speaking with us today on the podcast. She is the founder and president of the Albertus Project. She's been describing the origin of the Albertus Project, some of the ways that they've started to. I love that. That strikes me, Alex. For people who don't get it,
right?
And that's, I mean, sure, that's a shorthand, but it's not judging someone who doesn't get it. They just don't have the means, and they haven't had the education, or haven't really gotten that bite-sized bit of information to start them thinking.
Exactly.
And that's a really important part of it. So, I think that when I conceive of a small nonprofit, usually it's a start. Well, it is a startup, and it's very difficult, and it takes a lot of energy and work, and sometimes it makes it, sometimes it doesn't. Why has Albertus Project grown and developed rather than just kind of falling by the wayside?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it's because we have such a good community around us. We have people from, it's really cool. I get messages all the time. I just got a message from someone in New Zealand. Last week was Australia. Because I think what the value add that I like to say that we bring is just, like, meeting people where they're at. And that's something that I didn't understand before. I thought, like, for example, abstinence is the key, and that's the only way that someone can get better, quote unquote. But I realized, like, meet people where they're at, and that could be harm reduction for people who are using, and that can also mean people who just don't really get it, and we want to at least pull them into the conversation. That's how I feel. I want to pull the me's into the conversation. So, for example, there's something I know a lot of people have heard about it, Humans of New York, which is basically this amazing photographer in New York who takes a picture, and in the caption is, like, an amazing sort of story about this person's life, a specific instance. So what I thought to do was, like, I'm like, we're missing the human piece of this. We're taking apart humans, and we're thinking that they're robots and they need to live life in a specific way. And I felt like we're missing the empathy. We're missing realizing that, okay, while this person might be in a very different circumstance, at the end of the day, they have the same feelings, same responses, and they're just human like I am. So I took after Humans in New York, and we do something called Humans of Addiction, which is we take stories of people in active addiction, people in recovery, as well as their family and friends, who they send us a picture. I mean, it could be anonymous, and they write basically a story that they want to share with our following. And the response from that has just been amazing because A, it inspires people. B, it shows that these people are human at the end of the day, just like you and me. But it elevates these people, it gives these people a platform where they might not have had the opportunity to share. And again, it reaches a lot of people like me who typically would scroll past anything that has to do with addiction. It's sad, it's scary, you don't really know what to do, and it puts it into this sort of inspiring story where you want to learn more. And I think that's why we've had such success, just being honest and meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, well, I mean absolutely sounds right on, and this idea of stories is so important. I mean, we are creatures of story. We tell ourselves stories. We relate, and we, gather around the campfire before there was any kind of social media and told each
Yeah.
other stories, and that's such a thing that can be powerful. And I have seen some of those on your website. There, people should go there and tell me the website first, so I make sure I
Yeah,
get that
sure.
out there.
It's just albertusproject.org. And then we're really active on social media where you'd find us at Albertus Project, and you can check out all the cool stories that people have been, we've been blessed to get a lot of their stories and put it online.
Good. Just want to make sure that was out there already. So, your current structure, I know that you have a board of directors for Albertus. You have different people who are, I think, representing different types of people on your board. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so really so it's cool. So the board actually started where I ended up asking Reed's whole family. I'm like, hey, I would love you to be a part of this. So Gail, who is Reed's mom, sits on the board. Um, and I think she's a really valuable member. And I don't want to speak for her, but I'll tell you, it's been a learning journey for us both. I think both Gail and I had misconceptions of what would work for Reed and for people who are in active addiction. And I know that we've just learned a lot. So I have Gail on there. I have another friend who is very close with Reed. Again, a person who didn't understand the addiction space, but is really awesome with social media. And then I have my mom and my sister because they're the best. And I think it's a good
I like that. Their qualifications are, they're the best.
And they're just, like, I felt it was really important while we are supporting the addiction community. The other thing, like we talked about, the value add is just being able to support the family and friends. I feel like that's an often piece that's left out.
Yeah.
And Gail is the perfect example of someone who's done their homework, has educated themselves, and really can speak to.
Yeah.
I understand what you're going through, living with someone who's in active using alcohol, drugs, whatever it is. That is not easy.
Yeah. Well, you're really speaking Smart's language right there with family and friends, because we definitely see the incredible importance of having a group that is geared towards people who can come and talk about, their loved one, whether it's a friend or a family member, and kind of get their own practical ideas for how they want to interact with this person, what kind of environment they want to be in with this person. So that's one thing that Smart is definitely, among the other things we'll go into about, you mentioned harm reduction, and I don't think you spoke yet of medication assisted treatment, but these are all things that Smart is definitely involved in and all about, and that's why we line up so nicely with the Albertus Project.
Exactly. Well, I was going to say, and on the idea of Smart. So when I started trying to educate myself in this space, and again, it's a daily process, all I knew was the 12 steps. I thought that's the end all be all. I was told that's the end all be all. I've been told by people in that program, if people do not use that program, they're basically good as gone. So that is all I knew. I knew it from movies, I knew it from conversations. And I'm like, hey, is there something else that exists? There's gotta be, because if I was in recovery, I know for myself, I would not align to the 12 steps. While it's great and works for millions of people, it all doesn't work for everyone. And that is where I found Smart. And I realized how important it is for people to understand all the different options that exist, and that there is not a one size fits all. And a lot of the work that I've been doing actually recently on my podcast was getting all the representatives from all the different groups out there, the alternatives to the 12 steps. And I had Mike Hopper, who is from the state outreach.
Yeah, he's the state outreach director for Ohio. Mike Hooper.
Yeah, Mike Hooper. And Mike is awesome because we just got to talk about like what Smart Recovery is, what it isn't. And I really aligned to Smart Recovery because you guys are supportive of harm reduction, meeting people where they're at, understanding that, most people will love Smart Recovery, but that's not the only thing. There's other options, and you're supportive of that. And I just think it's so important as I learn more and more and try to spread the message that if I see a post, which I do often, my daughter is not happy in 12 steps, is there something else? Recommending Smart Recovery and the different options for people to understand. they don't have to be boxed in, because I can only imagine going through trying to be in recovery and feeling like this is not working
Right.
for me. If this isn't working for me, I'm done. I got to make this work.
Right. I mean, there are these multiple pathways to recovery. They're so important that you don't judge and say, you don't have to say this is better, this is worse, this is
Exactly.
something, this is not. It's what is resonant with you. How is it helping you or a loved one, family member respond to the idea of moving beyond an addiction, or in
Yes.
some way addressing their addiction in a way that makes more positive, healthy life, and that's what it comes down to. I mean, how could you be against anything that was going to end up helping people to do that? And at Smart, we do feel like we do get forgotten about at times, and so we have to be clear and declare who we are and what we're
Right.
about. And we talked about stigma initially. I mean, Smart just doesn't buy into labels of
Yeah,
addict,
even names.
alcoholic.
And I
Yeah.
have to tell you, one of the first things that I did was I was on a conversation with someone, and this is shortly after Reed passed, and I said the term addict, and I basically got shunned from that conversation. And I was like, oh, like we don't need like. And then after I ended up calling someone, I'm like, did I say something wrong? They're like, oh, you're not supposed to use the term addict. It's stigmatizing. And this is where I'm like, no, like at the Albertus Project, if someone uses that word, we're not going to shun them. We're just going to say, hey, by the way, how you should say it is substance use disorder, a person with an addiction. And I happen to really love that Smart does not use labels, because that is so aligned with what I believe. Reed was more than her addiction. All these people suffering are musicians, artists, teachers. Like that does not define a person. And I think it's important that people don't think that is all that they are. They're so much more than just a label.
Right. It's so reductionist to say, to
Yes.
say that. Now I do know people in 12 steps that are fine with that label. They wear it as either
Badge of
a
honor.
reminder or an inspiration to
Yep.
say, this is part of who I am, but not all of who I am. And I think that's the key right there. I was curious, when you talk about these people that do approach Albertus, or you've been approaching otherwise, I mean, do they try to pigeonhole you into some kind of, well, what's your agenda here? What's kind of the way you're trying to go about things? I mean,
Yeah, you know what? I thank God haven't really got that. I get a lot of what I think the Albertus Project is sort of known for is A, I want to submit my story and tell it, and B, can you help me? Which I love. People are finding out about us in so many different settings, and a lot, I would say, of the questions that we get are from family and friends. Because I feel like, and I know we just talked about it, but like those are the forgotten few, right? Those people are so critical to helping a person get into recovery and being a part of their inner circle. They know the person best. They know their drinking or using habits. They know when they use, why they use, what effect does that have? And I think it's important that we empower these people, and we often forget that these people are suffering, frankly, just as much as the person in active use is, and they don't know how to cope. And it's scarring to these people. And there's something that I've been learning about, which is, and it reminds me a lot of SMART. It's called CRAFT. It's community reinforcement and family training.
correct.
I just took that course, and it was amazing. And it's basically using the power of family members to help get that person into treatment. But I think it's really important that we rally around the family members and the friends and use them and their knowledge to that person's advantage to try to help them.
Well, it becomes a resource. It becomes a resource for
Exactly.
the whole system, if you will.
Right.
And when someone has a substance use disorder, and is the chaos that accompanies it, some of the other things that go on, the misunderstandings, the miscommunication, bringing some resources to bear through craft, or SMART also uses very much the principles and practices of cognitive behavioral therapy.
And you guys have your own family and friends sort of group that I've actually been a part of a couple of times.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, because when I was sort of looking into that, all I knew was Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, which is fantastic for many people, but there's not a lot of other alternative to the 12-step groups that offer that. So I think it's really special that SMART has that, because these people need just as much support, and they need to be at a good place, right? Like I always equate it to like an oxygen mask falling in an airplane. You're told to put your oxygen mask on before you can help someone else. And that's how we need to be treating the situation with family
That's
members.
right.
Friends.
That's right. And not stigmatized, not
Right.
stigmatized and told that what we're doing is wrong or how we're going
Enabling
about it.
And yeah, it's just, see, this all goes to back sort of education. And it's just, I think about myself like a year ago, and I would have never thought this stuff. And it's the power of education and passion and trying to do the right thing.
That's Alex Collier. She's the founder and president of Albertus Project. We're talking with her on today's podcast, talking about the kinds of efforts she's undertaken in memory of her friend Reed, and the kinds of things that she's done to educate and advocate. One thing I noticed, Alex, on your website, it talked about medication-assisted treatment. And aren't you involved with some state grants? Is that what I understand?
Yeah. So one thing, who knew that there was medicine for alcoholism and opioid use disorder? But I started doing my research and speaking to some doctors and therapists, and that exists. And not only does medication-assisted treatment exist, but it is so important that we help people be educated on it and know that they can leverage it, because it has so many advantages, most of all, decreasing mortality from an overdose. So as soon as I figured out, like, holy smokes, this is like a tool that everyone needs to know about, whether they want to or not, fine, but we at least need to give them the option. So I started doing my research. And what I've done, and the Albertus Project has done, thanks to all the donations, which were 100% donation based, is work with treatment centers in Virginia, West Virginia, and also Texas and other states too, but those are the three right now, to help fund people who cannot pay for their medication assisted treatment, as well as their transportation too. I knew, for example, West Virginia had the highest mortality from opioid overdoses, and I could not believe the numbers that I saw. So I ended up reaching out to Acadia Healthcare, which runs like 7 out of 9 methadone clinics in the whole state. And I spoke to them and I'm like, tell me right now, boots on the ground, are people able to afford what they need? And are they able to afford their Suboxone or their methadone, whatever? And they said no. And not only that, Alex, it costs so much for people to get into our doors in the terms of the transportation. We don't have buses. Ubers are basically non-existent, and taxis are very expensive. So what we decided to do was fund in different states, starting with West Virginia. Because how I look at it is, Reed was fortunate enough to go to the States from Canada to all the different rehabs, and that's because her, family did well, and I know she was grateful for that. But not everyone has that opportunity, and money should never stand in the way of a person's recovery. And I wanted to make sure that while we can help as many people as possible. So we are 110% on board with medication-assisted treatment. And feel like that is just such a fundamental tool that everyone needs to be educated on. And I'll tell you, there are so many people that I speak with, both family members and friends and people in active use, who have never even known that that was an option. So yeah. I think it's just really important that we continue to talk about it. And I'll say one thing, there are groups that I know that are not supportive of medication-assisted treatment, and something that I know I spoke about with Mike, and when I was doing my research on SMART, it's really important to me that organizations who are supporting the addiction community are talking about it and are supportive. As long as it's used correctly, to me, it should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, with prescribed by a medical doctor.
Exactly,
and that kind of thing.
SMART is all on board and supportive of that, and for that, I'm just grateful, because it's another opportunity for people to know about it.
Talking about kind of labels and words and such, I've started to hear the term medication-assisted recovery. And I like that. I like that because it's the sense of where we're going forward. Treatment can be kind of static. You get treatment, but recovery is a process, recovery moving on. And the other thing you mentioned about, the overdose, I was talking with the deputy director of NIDA on this podcast, and he said, very shockingly, he said, look, if we can't keep people alive, then we can't help them to recover.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. And I've called a couple of different groups, and I've said, I have a question. If someone is, taking as prescribed medication-assisted treatment, what is your recovery group's thoughts on that? And they're like, oh, they're not welcome. And I said, just let me understand. They're like, that's not really recovery. And I think the traditional thought for many is, hey, I've gone cold turkey, So you have to too, otherwise that doesn't count. And again, as we talk about the different pathways to recovery, it's so important that isn't the most important thing is that we keep people alive. To me, the thought that people have to be like, for example, I'm very open about it. I'm on anxiety medication because that makes me me and it makes me at a great state. If someone would discount me not being myself because I was on medicine, I tell them that they're crazy. Like, who are you to tell me that doesn't work for my life when I know that it does? So I know there's still stigma out there with taking medicine. When I tell people that, when I speak to different potential donors, some are like, this is amazing, Alex, good for you. And some are like, I'm not sure. And I'm like, what are you not sure about? So that's another thing. Again, we got to tackle the stigma. I've learned now being in this for about a year and a half that there is a ton of stigma outside, right, from the general public. There's also a lot of stigma inside. And I think that's something, no wonder why it's so difficult for everyone else to understand, because we have so many different voices in between. And to me, we need to unite at least on most fundamental things to be able to message successfully outwards.
I mean, we're back to what stories get told and untold. And the stories about medication assisted recovery or treatment are that it just keeps them addicted, just keeps them part of in a drug culture. And it's really not like that. It's really about the health aspects and keeping people able to take advantage of things like recovery groups and recovery pathways. And it also is, rises into the other topic of harm reduction. If people are, able to, satisfy what they need to satisfy physically or, in some kind of way, then they're not going to be doing negative social things out there to try to get that. I mean, I'm talking about crime or other kinds of things.
And the idea of harm reduction, I remember having a distinct conversation, repass in January and March, and someone talking about harm reduction. And I was like, oh, no, that doesn't make any sense. And they're like, explain to me why it doesn't make sense. I said, Alex, we don't not drive because it's dangerous. We wear a seatbelt. And Alex, what about a bike? Do you ride a bike? I said, yeah. She says, do you wear a helmet? I said, yeah. She said, that's harm reduction. And just that information, I was like, fair, right? And the idea of, at the end of the day, it should not be punitive action. It's the idea that everyone deserves human rights, dignity, and autonomy. And if we can just decrease the bad stuff around drugs, let's just make it easy, we can allow them to do what they need to do in order to protect them as much as possible. And it should be so easy that we support that. But there's a lot of stigma even around the idea of harm reduction. And I was in a Smart Recovery meeting actually yesterday because I like attending to sort of learn more and be able to share with people who ask me questions. And it was one of the first meetings that I went to. The first thing that was talked about after they talked more about SMART and what it is was a gentleman saying, I've been using harm reduction and I'm so grateful that all of you have been supportive of that. And I think of other groups where that might not have been tolerated. And I think about how sorry I would feel for that individual because they would not have felt supported. And God forbid, if they use again, they don't have a community.
They may have been driven out of that support group.
But the idea that he knew he had the backing of everyone in his SMART group was just, it made me so happy because that's what it should be about at the end of the day. Meeting people where they're at and knowing like, hey, I got this community and they trust me and they got my back.
Yeah. And that becomes kind of that peer-to-peer support. And that's another kind of unique thing about SMART. We were started by peers and professionals working together. And, lived experience plus the kinds of evidence-based, like I said, the CBT, the REBT, the kinds of things, the motivational interviewing. Pardon me?
Evidence-based stuff. And I saw yesterday, I was looking at your guys' website and I saw that basically it talked about as science continues to evolve and change, so does what you recommend to do, which sounds like very minute, but I think that's really important because I know there's a lot of different things, right? If we think about it, our recovery and treatment programs are no better or worse than they were in the 1950s. They just stagnated, right? But the idea that, if something new and better comes up, SMART is accepting and wanting to incorporate it, says everything that I think people need to know about evidence-based treatment and how you can actually recover and get better.
And even, I mean, the obvious part of that is with medication and other kinds of treatments. But even, I mean, there's research out there that talks about when someone faces stigma, they're less likely to succeed. They're less likely to continue and remain in recovery. So there's some research right there, some evidence that stigma actually hurts and harms,
For sure.
and the labels that are going with it. I mean, we talk about someone's clean or clean time, and
Exactly.
someone slips or relapses. I mean, the whole thing about kind of starting back at ground zero, which many 12-step traditions talk about, is there's a story that goes around. If you're driving from California to New York and you get a flat tire in Kansas, you don't fix the tire and then go back and start again in California.
Yeah.
And it's just, this sense of like meeting people where they're at, like you said, keeping people, first and foremost in your mind, not what should or ought to be, but how the person is, who the person is, and how they're doing. So, well, this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap up, is there anything else, Alex, that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I was going to say, so one thing that I want to make sure that we put out there is recently the Albertus Project just got a grant from Walmart that allows us to help the recovery community and those even in active addiction as much as possible. So one thing that I found that a lot of people have messaged the Albertus Project about before is like, hey, I am homeless and I am trying to be in recovery and I just don't have money for food or whatever. What we do is we can, if they sign up, we can send them whatever food that they need and water, and it's literally goes straight to the door or wherever that they need it to be. Works all over the United States. So check out our website. The link is there. But if you are in active addiction or recovery and need like hygiene, toiletries, food, whatever, we got you. And we want to make sure that that does not stand in the way of someone being able to fully, attain what they want to do.
Great. That's Alex Collier. She's the founder and president of Albertus Project. We've been talking on the podcast today. Alex, great conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. Thanks for joining us. This is Luke Frazier. Until next time on the podcast, stay healthy and stay connected.